In the Italian province of Bologna lies the small village of Marzabotto, under the brutal control of the Social Republic of Italy, also known as Salò, the newest incarnation of Benito Mussolini's fascist takeover of the peninsula and a puppet state for Nazi Germany. Due to the rising popularity and strength of the Resistenza anti-fascist movement, the German SS police force and Italian collaborators entered the village to squash the resistance there. In what is still today the deadliest mass shooting in Italian history, the fascists murdered a minimum of 770 Marzabotto residents, including over 100 children, 150 elderly, 300 women, and 5 priests. 30 years later, Italian screenwriter Sergio Citti would approach Pier Paolo Pasolini, poet and filmmaker, about a seemingly unrelated film. It was Pasolini's idea to change the setting of this proposed film to 1944 Bologna.
Se non ci ammazza i crucchi, se non ci ammazza i bricchi ed i crepacci e il vento di Marenca, se non ci ammazza i crucchi, se non ci ammazza i bricchi, quando saremo vecchi ne avremo da raccontare, quando saremo vecchi ne avremo da raccontare. La mia mamma mi diceva non andare sulle montagne, mangerai sol polette e castagne, ti verrà la città.
Part 1. The Marquis de Sade. Donatien Alphonse François Marquis de Sade was an 18th century aristocrat and author. Much of his writing centered around the idea of the libertines, a group of people, usually aristocrats and wealthy nobles, who lived by a philosophy that basically said morality is unnecessary, authority, especially religious authority, is invalid, and that people should just pursue their passions, particularly lust, to the fullest extent. Many of his works straddled the line between horror, erotic fiction, and autobiography. De Sade wrote extensively on his interpretation of the libertine lifestyle as one of extreme sexual deviancy. His favorite subjects were sodomy, rape, and torture, and according to some historical accounts, he likely participated in all of those in his personal life. He is literally where we get the word sadism from. In 1785, while imprisoned at the Bastille, de Sade began writing his magnum opus. This novel depicts 4 libertine men buying or kidnapping several young boys and girls and spiriting them away to a secluded castle in the Bavarian countryside. Once there, several older, experienced prostitutes would regale them with stories of their most disturbing and disgusting career exploits, and inspired by these tales, the libertines would then perform similar acts on their young victims. These acts included psychological abuse, anal sex, usually if not always non-consensual, coprophagia, physical torture and dismemberment, and ultimately murder. Despite being thoroughly outlined and partially written, the novel wasn't finished, and was ultimately lost to de Sade, who never recovered the manuscript, forever hidden away in the walls of his cell. Many years after de Sade's death, the manuscript would be recovered, and after a long journey would eventually be published in 1904. Titled 120 Days of Sodom, this novel has become the subject of over a century of study, analysis, and critique. It is arguably the most controversial work of European literature, and it was the idea of adapting this novel into a film that Sergio Citti had suggested to Pier Pasolini. Part 2. What? Hey y'all, it's Nolan, and welcome back to the most disturbing films of all time! Today we're talking about another film that is usually in the number 1 or number 2 spot on the lists of disturbing films. After racking my brain for a long time trying to write this script, I realized that this movie gave me far more to say than I expected. As you can probably tell by the length of this video, this isn't going to be a quick and simple review. So strap in, baby doll, and pay attention to the spoiler warning, because we're fixing to deeply penetrate an Italian art film. Released in 1975, directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini, Salò, or 120 Days of Sodom, is the first and only nearly direct adaptation of the Marquis de Sade's unfinished novel. The film departs somewhat from the book, not only in time and place, but it's notably presented in segments inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy. After 3 minutes of credits, the film opens with our first segment, Ant'Inferno, or The Place Before Hell. We see the 4 libertines who go by the titles of the Duke, the Bishop, the Magistrate, and the President signing some kind of contract. The film then shows several scenes of boys being kidnapped at gunpoint by police, soldiers, and armed thugs that kind of look like mafiosi. Some of these boys acquire positions of power, though, as we next see Claudio dressed as a soldier himself, spitting on a young woman. The 4 girls are shown to be the daughters of the 4 libertine men, and the men express their intention to marry each other's daughters to seal the agreement that they've made.
Cari amici, sposando le nostre rispettive figlie uniremo per sempre i nostri destini.
At this point, I should note that the first 30 minutes of this movie is really slow. Like, I know meticulously paced is the term you use when you want to sound smarter than you actually are. Meticulous, almost slow pacing, but it's not working for me here. It's one thing to linger on the scenes that are meant to be disturbing or disgusting in order to solidify the effect, but lingering on establishing shots and unimportant dialogue is just boring! The libertines then arrive at some large hall where several boys are gathered. Some Pizza the Hut looking dude tries to sell them on the quality of the boys, a couple of them are forced to strip and show their junk, and the libertines then submit small written notes into a box as if they're voting. This is repeated in a smaller room, followed by a similar scene that's basically the same thing, but with girls this time. At one point, while being examined by the libertines, one of the girls breaks down sobbing, and the libertine men all stand and react with obvious sadistic glee. We also see some bad ADR. What is it with these Italian films and bad ADR? Hold on a second. Oh. I owe Cannibal Holocaust an apology when I said this. The issue, though, is that all of Cannibal Holocaust dialogue is done with ADR, and the ADR isn't really that good. Apparently, most films made in Italy from the 50s through to the 80s used very old equipment because it was often all that was available, especially for lower-budget indie and underground films. These cameras were usually so noisy when operating that it was basically impossible to record audio on set, so Italian films during this time period had to use ADR for most or all of the dialogue. It doesn't make Salò or Cannibal Holocaust easier to watch knowing this, but I won't call this bad filmmaking because it was basically out of anyone's control. We get to Marzabotto where one of the boys tries to escape but is gunned down. The cameraman forgets what tripods are, the libertines tell a joke after murdering a child because they're dicks.
Capite la differenza che passa tra l'ora, il dottore e la famiglia?
No, naturalmente, ce lo dica, siamo ansiosi.
L'ora è di un'ora, il dottore è dottore.
E la famiglia?
Sta bene, grazie.
The audio levels are poorly mixed, and we finally reach the palatial mansion where the remainder of the film will take place. Here we're introduced to the 4 storytellers, older prostitutes who throughout the film regale the libertines and their captives with stories of their past exploits. The captive children are taken into the yard and forced to hear a speech about how terrible their time is going to be, while the servants of the mansion watch on from behind a corner, until they're chased off by a collaborator, and we get a few seconds to focus on this particular servant woman, who I'm sure will in no way become important later on. Now the second segment, the Circle of Manias. Yep, we're officially in hell. The whole group sit in a large room called the Hall. A piano player plays the piano, and one of the storytellers weaves a tale about being a child prostitute. This is actually a good time to mention the music in Salò. There basically is none. The film chooses for all of the music to be diegetic, which means the only music is whatever is happening in the universe of the film. In other words, if we're hearing the music, the characters are hearing that music too. One of the libertines takes a boy to an adjacent room, presumably for some no-no times, but soon returns very angry because the boy had the audacity to pull away from him. More of the same perverted story and perverted activities continues until a girl tries to run away by jumping out the window, but is sadly unsuccessful. Everyone eats dinner, a girl is anally raped, one of the libertines is anally not raped, they sing a fascist battle song, and then the girls are taught how to give a handjob using a mannequin. We then cut back to the hall where one of the side doors is open to show a girl having been killed because she had the audacity to pray.
I più piccoli atti religiosi da parte di qualunque soggetto verranno puniti con la morte.
Noted. There's another story time, after which the men decide to take one of the boys and one of the girls to another room and have a collaborator and a storyteller. Okay, I gotta be straight with y'all if you haven't figured it out already. There's no nice way to describe anything that happens in this movie. They force the two kids to orgasm. While that is going on, the four libertines engage in their first of many meandering conversations about philosophy. And it's those meandering conversations about philosophy that had me struggling to write this video. Because Salò is a film that actually has a lot to say, much more than the other films we've looked at so far. So let's take a break from the movie for a second to talk about Part 3, The Contradictions of Fascism. Friedrich Nietzsche was a 19th century German mustache enthusiast and philosopher. He's credited as one of the founding figures in the philosophy of nihilism, the idea that there is no real inherent meaning to life. One of his contributions to this philosophy was the notion of the Übermensch, or Superman. The Superman is the person that can push on and continue living despite the lack of any true meaning to life, by creating his own meaning.
Faster than a speeding bullet. More powerful than a locomotive.
Push on and continue living despite the lack of any true meaning to life.
Now the Man of Steel, Superman!
Over the next several decades, some political writers, whose facial hair was noticeably inferior to Nietzsche and other better philosophers, would build upon these ideas, and from their writings was birthed the groundwork of the radical right-wing political ideology now known as fascism. This field of political theory took hold in countries like France, Spain, and notably Italy and Germany. By the 20s and 30s, fascist political parties were serious contenders for national power throughout much of Europe. I'll assume you're familiar with how the rest of this story goes: Mussolini, Hitler, World War II, and the Holocaust. Despite becoming the poster boy philosopher for the up-and-coming German Nazis, Nietzsche's sister actually edited his work after he died, cutting out the bits where he rejected anti-Semitism and nationalism, two of the key components to European fascism, giving us our first of seemingly infinite contradictions to fascist philosophy. You can only use nihilism to support Nazism if you first take out some of the core aspects of nihilism. But the contradictions don't stop there! In Italy, Giovanni Gentile was given the title of the philosopher of fascism. He was basically Mussolini's personal ideologue who would attempt to argue intellectually whatever would support fascism on the ground. His main theory was the idea of actual idealism, a position so incoherent that nobody really understands what he was saying. He simultaneously agreed with philosophy greats like Hegel while disagreeing with the foundation of their philosophy. And this frankly dumbass notion gets us to one of the 14 core features of fascism. Umberto Eco, like Salò's director Pasolini, grew up in fascist Italy and saw firsthand its evils. He famously wrote a book called Ur-Fascism, in which he gives one of the best explanations of what fascism actually looks like through his 14 core features. The third of these features is actions for action's sake, which was Gentile's idea. It means that action should be celebrated even if it's taken before or without any reflection, because thinking is emasculating. Eco also describes how fascism is contradictory in espousing individualism while also being collectivist and totalitarian, how the enemies of fascism are simultaneously depicted as strong enough to take over the world but yet being from weaker, inferior races, and the contradiction of praising tradition and rejecting modernism while itself being a modern invention that destroys and undermines the traditions of the people it takes over. Basically, in short, fascism as an idea is riddled with more holes in a bucket in a shooting range, yet the contradictions and incoherencies of fascism would be plastered over through the superficial appearance of high art, flowery language, and misunderstood political citations. This fake intellectualism was used to fool the world into seeing fascism as a kind of legitimate political theory. Our filmmaker Pierpaolo Pasolini was an open communist and virulent anti-fascist, and he used much of his art to try and fight the continuation or revival of fascism in Italy and France. Salò is one of these works, and it possibly cost him his life. Salò consistently shows libertines quoting works of classic literature and philosophy, especially Nietzsche, as if they're men of high education and intellect, but these scenes are sandwiched between them doing all of the horrific things the film is infamous for. The point is made so clear I could understand someone critiquing it as being too heavy-handed. Ultimately, the message of Salò is this: fascism in Italy was not some vanguard of heroic men fighting for some noble Italian homeland, but rather a bunch of sadistic, pedophilic, murderous lunatics destroying the very future they claim to be protecting. There's one scene in particular that I think drives this point home more clearly than anything else, but we'll get there soon enough. Back to the movie! After talking about how totalitarians are somehow anarchists, the libertines force the two kids that they just jacked off to get married. The kids attempt to consummate the union, but the men step in and do rapey stuff that I can't show. The libertines then get super drunk while quoting more philosophy, and then after another story time in the hall, one of the men takes a girl to the bathroom to watch her pee and force her to watch him do the same. The kids are forced to act like dogs, being brought in on leashes and eating scraps from bowls on the floor, until one of the boys refuses and is whipped by the magistrate, and it looks pretty real to the point that I'm not sure it actually isn't. The magistrate isn't all bad though, as he takes some polenta from the table and feeds it to the president's daughter.
It's not a fucking good job.
One more story time before we go deeper into hell. If you thought the first hour of Salò was hard to watch, just you wait. We are now entering Girona de la Merda, or literally, the Circle of Shit. We now get a very long sequence of one of the storytellers discussing anal sex, and the Duke, primarily, talking about his mother. One of the girls begins to weep, missing her family, and all the men discuss ways to punish her for her outburst. Here comes what is possibly the most infamous scene in the film, as the Duke pulls down his pants and defecates onto the floor, where the previously weeping girl is forced to eat the excrement. Lasting a full 2 minutes, this scene is painfully grotesque, and we're only beginning this portion of the film. The woman finishes her story, there's some more perversion, and then cut to the libertines drinking tea or coffee in a small lounging room where they come to the decision to engage in some unspecified act. The girls and boys have their rooms, specifically their chamber pots, inspected to make sure they're following this new unspoken rule, and we finally see where this is all going. This is a scene that I said earlier best drives home the point that Salò is making about fascist philosophy. All gathered in the dining room, with one of the boys dressed in a wedding gown next to the president, everyone is listening to the sounds of a speech. I couldn't track down the source of this specific speech, but it's clearly some type of fascist political philosophy being espoused on the state radio. The libertines and storytellers react as if they're smelling the sweetest aroma, but what is wheeled into the dining room is a cart literally full of feces, and it's served to everyone who is forced to eat it, except for the libertines who do so gladly. The point couldn't be made clearer. Fascist philosophy is being equated to eating shit. This scene is 3 minutes long. More story time about butt stuff, the Duke makes a girl pee on his face, and then the libertines organize the best analogy for how under fascism, democracy is only a superficial illusion. The men are brought into a darkened room where a few of the captive youths are gathered in a circle, bent over in a way where only their butts are really visible. The men then inspect the rear ends, all the while speaking about them as if this is some great intellectual exercise, before finally voting on which one is the best. The boy who was chosen is held at gunpoint and psychologically tortured by being made to believe he'll be shot only for the gun to be empty, and then he is told that he won't get away so easily.
Imbecille. Come potevi pensare che ti avremmo ucciso? Non lo sai che noi vorremmo ucciderti 1000 volte, fino ai limiti dell'eternità, se l'eternità potesse avere dei limiti.
One last story time to finish off this segment, and then we enter the tail end of the film, the Circle of Blood. 3 of the libertine men, the Duke, Magistrate, and President, are all getting dressed in very wealthy women's outfits and are brought into a room where the bishop sits dressed in some really weird garb. What follows is a wedding ceremony between the libertines and their male collaborators. I haven't mentioned this yet, but the collaborators are called studs and are implied to have been chosen because of their particular endowment downstairs. This is an idea that is taken directly from Marquis de Sade's novel. Speaking of which, we then get a very explicit scene of one of the studs having sex with the bishop. Finishing up and getting dressed, the bishop is stopped by one of the boys who tells him of another boy who is breaking the rules. From here we see a chain of snitching as every kid who is confronted with their violation of the rules tries to save themselves by ratting out other kids who are breaking even more rules. This snowball effect ends with showing that one of the collaborators had been having an affair with the servant girl that was shown all the way back at the beginning of the film. Their horizontal tango is interrupted by the libertines, who then execute the two. The captives are brought into a room where they're informed of all the violations and told that there will be appropriate punishment for each and every one of them. Returning to the hall, but this time only the libertines and the studs are present, we hear a story about torture and murder. We see that all of the victims are tied up in the bathroom, literally sitting in or around a barrel of shit. The rest of the film depicts the collaborators taking the captured young people to one of the mansion's courtyards, where they are then tortured, dismembered, and violently murdered, as the libertines take turns watching the torture from a window in a voyeuristic fashion. While this is going on, the pianist stops playing and throws herself out of a window to her death. The torture and murder continues with mostly incredible special effects. The fascists then tell a joke about dead communists, and the film ends with two collaborators dancing to music on the radio. Part 4. Review. So yeah, this movie absolutely deserves its place near the top of all the lists. Salò is excellent location and set design, as well as costuming. It's impossible to not be immersed in the setting of the film. It almost feels more like a full-color documentary from the 40s rather than a fictional movie from the 70s. The acting's pretty good despite audio issues, and nearly all of the special effects are powerfully realistic. Even the few effects that lack a bit still work due to the overall disturbing intent and general atmosphere of the film. We've already covered how Salò has a strong and important message which sets it apart from its disturbing film competition, and definitely gives it some respect points. I kind of already said it, but there's bad audio, some less than perfect cinematography choices, and a very slow first half. In fact, the film in general comes off as a bit overly long. Salò is roughly 2 hours in length, and you feel that entire 2 hours passing by. Honestly, you could cut this movie down by about 30 minutes, and I think it would be an improvement. Salò is obviously a controversial film. The depictions of underage sexual acts particularly caused a great deal of issue for audiences and authorities. It doesn't help that Pasolini himself was far from perfect, and in his personal life allegedly was caught multiple times engaging in acts with very young men or even underage boys. This does make it hard to take the film seriously, because it's ostensibly against these moral evils, so yeah, take that for what you will. Due to the high level of nudity and the explicit nature of the sex scenes, not to mention the rape, torture, murder, and more, this film was banned in most countries upon its release, and there's still an ongoing debate among censors and critics on whether or not it should be classified as pornography. It was only in the 2000s that countries like Australia and New Zealand finally allowed the film to be released at all. I mentioned earlier that this film possibly cost Pasolini his life, and I meant that seriously. On November 2nd, 1975, right before the release of Salò, Pier Paolo Pasolini was brutally murdered. To this day, there is mystery surrounding the circumstances of his death. But one of the theories, and the one I believe to be true, is that he was assassinated by right-wing fascists or right-sympathizing mafiosi in retaliation for his left-wing art, including the soon-to-be-released Salò. This is one of the only disturbing films that generally gets positive critical acclaim. It even has a Criterion Collection Blu-ray release. I think that's mostly because of the important message that Pasolini lost his life attempting to convey. All that said though, nearly 50 years after the release of Salò, I'm not sure how relevant the message is anymore. It's not like there's some trend of anti-left pseudo-intellectuals misusing philosophy and media to push white supremacy and anti-Semitism and radical right-wing ultranationalism, leading to fascists taking positions of legitimate political authority nowadays.
Things need to be particularized.
My answer is something called science.
The ethnosay is an ideal that it would be a state for all people of the white race.
Sono una donna, sono una madre, sono italiana, sono cristiana, non me lo toglierete!
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
A violent neo-Nazi street gang and grew into a political party with seats in both the national and European parliaments.
Oh. Part 5. Conclusion. Those of us who do not have first-hand experience or memory of the realities of the political and moral evils of fascism have a responsibility to understand it and fight against it. And as surprising as it might be for this series of film reviews, I think a movie like Salò could play a positive role in helping some people reach that understanding. It's definitely a hard film to watch. As far as whether or not I recommend it, I'd say that if you've watched this review and think you can handle the really gross things I've described, then I absolutely think you should check out Salò. However, if you can't even hear about some of this stuff without feeling a bit queasy, then don't watch this movie, at least not without a bucket nearby. Unfortunately for me, the bulk of the film is more disgusting rather than disturbing, which is an important distinction and something that loses a few points. That said, when you consider that the movie is almost entirely sexual assault, and you factor in the deserved critical acclaim, it raises the disturbing nature by a lot. Personally, I'd put Salò, or 120 Days of Sodom, right behind Serbian Film on the disturbing films ranking list. I want to real quick apologize for taking such a long time to put this video out. I've had some changes in my personal and professional life, so it took me a lot longer to work on this than I originally expected. I also experimented a bit with the format and style, as you can probably tell. Let me know in the comments below what you thought about that. Do you think I should continue to kind of explore themes more deeply, or would you prefer just a short synopsis and technical review like I did in the first couple episodes? Anyhow, that was Salò, or 120 Days of Sodom. Here's the disturbing films list. As always, if there's anything on this list you'd like to see soon, or anything not on this list that you really think should be, then let me know in the comments below. And if you want to make sure to check out the next episode of The Most Disturbing Films of All Time, as soon as it comes out, don't forget to subscribe. I have noticed a few requests in the comments of previous episodes, so that's what we're going to be tackling in the immediate future. And remember, as Salò points out, fascists can use all the intellectual language and philosophy jargon they want, but what they really do is rape your kids and eat shit. Thanks for watching.
Stamattina mi sono alzato, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Stamattina mi sono alzato e ho trovato l'invaso. Oh partigiano, portami via. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire.